The night my husband accepted the Innovator of the Year award, I was sitting at table 31 near the fire exit, next to a stranger who kept checking his phone. I had worn the green dress, the one I bought 3 years ago for a conference I never ended up attending because our daughter broke her arm 2 days before and I spent that weekend in the pediatric wing of Mercy General instead. It still had the tags on until that morning. I remember standing in front of the mirror thinking, "You look like someone who belongs in that room." I needed to believe that. I did not know, when I got dressed, that I would be leaving that room alone. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, legally, on paper, in every way that the state of Illinois recognizes, had been nominated for the award 3 months earlier. The Illinois Bio-Innovation Summit. It's a big deal in our world. Or what used to be our world before I quietly stepped out of it to raise our daughter and do the invisible work that doesn't show up on anyone's LinkedIn profile. He called me from the office when he got the nomination email. "They actually did it," he said. "They nominated me." And I said of course they did, and I meant it. I was proud of him. I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly proud of him. The way you are when someone you love gets something good. What I didn't say, because there was no reason to say it at the time, was that the core methodology underlying the product that got him nominated, the biomarker sequencing protocol that his company had licensed and built their entire diagnostic platform on, was mine. I had developed it during my postdoc at Northwestern. I had filed the patent application myself, paid the initial fees myself, and assigned the licensing rights to a joint holding entity that my husband and I had set up together when we got married. Back when we were still the kind of people who stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about building something together. That was 12 years ago. The protocol was now generating roughly $4 million a year in licensing revenue for his company. They had sub-licensed it to 2 other firms. The original valuation, the last time anyone had formally assessed it, was just over $200 million. I knew all of this. I just hadn't thought about it in a while. The dinner was at the Fairmont on Michigan Avenue. I took an Uber because my husband had gone ahead with his business partner, someone I'll call the business partner, though his actual role in my life that evening was closer to accomplice, to do some pre-event press. That should have told me something. It probably did, somewhere underneath everything, and I just chose not to listen. I found my seat. Table 31, near the fire exit. My name card was printed in a smaller font than the others, or maybe I imagined that. The centerpiece was an orchid arrangement that blocked my view of the stage. My husband was at table 4. I could see the back of his head. The woman next to him, I did not know her name yet, was laughing at something he said. She had her hand near his arm, not touching, just near. She was maybe 34. She had the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her life been seated at table 31. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things that evening. He won. Of course he won. He walked up to that stage in the suit I had picked out. We'd argued about the tie. I wanted navy. He went with burgundy. And he accepted the award and he spoke for 4 minutes and he thanked, in order, his investors, his team, his business partner by name, 3 specific employees by name, his late father and the city of Chicago. He did not thank me. I sat at table 31 and I watched the room applaud, and I thought, okay, just that. Okay, I was not devastated. I want to be clear about that. I had spent 12 years recalibrating my expectations in small, quiet ways, and this was just the latest adjustment. I filed it away and I picked up my glass of water and I looked at the orchid blocking my view and I thought about our daughter, who was home with the babysitter, who had asked me that morning to bring her back a dessert from the fancy party. I was going to leave right after the dinner, get a box of something from the pastry table, go home. That was the plan. I was at the coat check when she found me. I say found me because that's what it felt like. She had come looking. She was the woman from table 4. Up close, she was striking in the way that people are striking when they're used to being looked at. She smiled at me with the specific smile of someone who has decided they're going to be gracious. "You're his wife," she said. Not a question. "I am," I said. "He talks about you," she said, and something in her tone made the words land wrong like a compliment with a nail in it. "You used to work in biotech, right? Before your daughter? That's really sweet. You must be so proud of what he's built." I looked at her. I want you to understand the specific texture of that moment. The coat check woman was holding my coat. There was music playing somewhere behind us, something with a piano. It smelled like gardenias and expensive food. And this woman was standing in front of me with her gracious smile, telling me that I used to work in biotech, past tense, before my daughter, as though my daughter were the explanation for why I had faded from relevance. She wasn't being cruel in the obvious way. She was being cruel in the careful way, the way that leaves no marks. It must be hard, she continued, being at these events when so much of the technical conversation goes over your head. You're such a good sport for coming. I took my coat. I said, "It was nice to meet you." And I left. I sat in the back of the Uber and I looked out the window at the city, and I did not cry. I thought about crying and decided against it. What I felt was not grief. It was something colder, more precise. You used to work in biotech, right? Before your daughter. She had said it like an epitaph. I got home. I paid the babysitter, a junior at DePaul named Rosie, who has absolutely nothing to do with this story, but who I will always think of as the last normal moment before everything changed. I checked on my daughter. She was asleep, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. I had forgotten the dessert. I went to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the counter and I thought. Here is what I thought about. The joint holding entity my husband and I had set up in 2013 was called Mercer Voss Innovations LLC. Mercer was my name. Voss was his. I was listed as the managing member with a 60% interest. The licensing agreement between Mercer Voss and his company, Voss Diagnostics Inc., was a perpetual license with a 20-year term, executed in 2016 with a clause that allowed the licensor to terminate for material breach with 30 days written notice. I am, or I was, a biotech attorney. I had drafted that clause myself. I had not thought about it in years. But I had drafted it, and I knew exactly what it said, and I knew exactly what constituted material breach. And I knew that my husband had, on at least 2 documented occasions, publicized the protocol to third parties without obtaining my written consent as required under Section 7(b) of the agreement. I had flagged it at the time. He had said it was an oversight. I had let it go. I stood in my kitchen and I thought, I don't have to let it go. I called my attorney the next morning. Not my husband's attorney, not our shared family attorney, my attorney, a woman I had kept on retainer since before we got married, because my mother always said, keep your own lawyer and your own bank account, and I had listened to that advice even when I stopped listening to a lot of other things. I told her what I needed. She said, give me 48 hours. My husband came home at 2 in the morning. I was still awake, reading. He seemed surprised to find me up. You left early, he said. I was tired, I said. He nodded. He went to the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open and close. He came back to the doorway. Did you meet? He started. Yes, I said. I met her. He was quiet for a moment. It's not, he said. I know, I said. I turned off the light on my nightstand. He stood in the doorway for another few seconds, and then he went to the guest room, which told me everything I needed to know about the state of his conscience. I lay in the dark, and I thought about who I had been at 28, fresh out of law school, doing my postdoc on the side because I couldn't stop being curious, filing patent applications with my own hands because the work was mine and I knew it was important. I thought about who I had slowly, incrementally, cooperatively become, the wife, the mother, the good sport at the awards dinner, the woman who used to work in biotech. I thought about my daughter asleep down the hall. I thought, she is watching everything I do. 48 hours later, my attorney sent me the draft termination notice. It was 4 pages. It cited Section 7(b) of the licensing agreement, the 2 documented instances of unauthorized sublicensing, and formally notified Voss Diagnostics Inc. that the perpetual license to the Mercer biomarker sequencing protocol would terminate in 30 days from the date of receipt. I read it 3 times. I signed it. My attorney sent it via certified mail and electronic delivery to the registered agent of Voss Diagnostics Inc. and courtesy copies to each member of the board of directors. Then I made breakfast for my daughter, helped her with her spelling homework, and took her to soccer practice. My phone started ringing at 6:45 the next morning. I was still in bed. I looked at the screen. My husband. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again and again. By 7:15, I had 11 missed calls from him, 2 from a number I didn't recognize, and 1 from a board member whose name I did recognize because I had attended his daughter's christening 4 years earlier. My husband came to the bedroom door. "Did you send something to my board?" he said. His voice had a quality I had never heard before. Not anger exactly. More like someone standing at the edge of something and only just realizing how far down it goes. "I sent a legal notice," I said, "to the appropriate parties. You can't—" He started. "Section 7B, I said. 2 violations. It's all documented. You can have your attorney review it." He stared at me. I got up. I put on my robe. I went to start the coffee. I want to be honest about the next few days, because I think people get the wrong idea about what this kind of thing feels like from the inside. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't clean. My husband was frantic and then furious, and then, briefly, pleading in a way that was genuinely painful to watch. There were conversations I don't want to recount. There were things said that cannot be unsaid. His attorney called my attorney. Then his attorney called my attorney again. Then 2 members of the board called, not in a threatening way, but in a genuinely panicked way, because Voss Diagnostics had a significant financing round pending and the termination of the core protocol license was, as one of them put it, an existential issue. I understood that. I had understood it before I signed the notice. That was not an accident. I did not want to destroy the company. I want to be clear about that. There were 47 employees at Voss Diagnostics. Some of them were people I knew. Some of them had families. What I wanted was to stop being invisible. My attorney and I had prepared a proposed resolution before we ever sent the notice. It was not punitive. It restructured the licensing agreement to add my name to the attributed inventors on all public documentation, added me as a named licensor in all third-party sublicenses, modified the royalty structure to reflect my 60% ownership interest in Mercer Voss, and required my written consents for any future sublicensing. It also required a formal acknowledgement in writing, delivered to the full board of directors, that the biomarker sequencing protocol had been developed by me and licensed to the company through our joint entity. On paper. Signed. On the record. His attorney called it aggressive. My attorney called it accurate. There was an emergency board meeting on a Thursday afternoon. I was asked to attend. I almost said no. The old instinct, the Table 31 instinct, and then I thought about my daughter, and I said yes. I drove myself. I wore the same green dress. I am not going to describe the entire meeting because some of it is still in legal process and my attorney would be unhappy with me. What I will tell you is that I sat at that table, the actual table in the actual boardroom, and I laid out the history of the protocol, the patent filings, the original development work, the licensing structure, and the documented violations, clearly and without raising my voice. And I watched the faces of people who had attended my wedding and eaten at my dinner table, and never once asked what I had done before I became someone's wife. One of the board members, a woman, late 50s, who I had always liked, stopped me at one point and said, "You developed the entire sequencing methodology?" "Yes," I said. "And you filed the original patent?" "Yes." She looked at my husband for a long moment. He looked at the table. The resolution was signed 2 weeks later. Every term, substantially as written. The day after the signing, my daughter came home from school and told me her teacher had asked the class what their parents did for work. "What did you say?" I asked. She thought about it. I said, "You're a scientist and a lawyer," she said. "Is that right?" I looked at her, 10 years old, missing one front tooth, completely matter-of-fact about it, the way kids are matter-of-fact about things that make adults fall apart. "That's right," I said. She nodded like that settled something and went to get a snack. I have thought a lot since then about what it means to let yourself be erased. Not all at once. Nobody lets themselves be erased all at once. It happens in installments. You skip the conference because your child needs you. You let your husband be the public face of the thing because it's easier. You sit at table 31 because you don't want to make a fuss. You file it away and you adjust and you tell yourself it doesn't matter. And then one day, a woman in a beautiful dress tells you that you used to work in your own field, and something inside you says, no, I am still a biotech attorney. I never stopped being one, technically. My license was active, I just hadn't been using it. I've started using it again. I've been consulting on IP matters for 2 biotech startups in the Chicago area. Small work, but mine. Completely mine. The marriage is over. That happened, separately and quietly, the way things end when there isn't really anything left to hold on to once the pretending stops. We have a good custody arrangement. My daughter stays with me 4 nights a week and she is doing fine. I still have the joint holding entity, Mercer Voss Innovations, LLC, me as 60% managing member. The protocol is still generating licensing revenue. My name is on the documentation now, all of it. I am not angry. I want to say that and have it be believed because it's true. What I am is awake, in a way I hadn't been in a long time, in a way I didn't even know I had stopped being. You can spend years making yourself smaller because it seems like the loving thing to do, the accommodating thing, the good sport at the awards dinner thing. And maybe it is, for a while. But there is a version of you that exists before all the accommodating, that filed the patent applications with her own hands because the work was hers and she knew it was important, and that version does not actually go away. She just waits. Mine waited 12 years. She was patient. And when the time came, she didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. She didn't send a single text message she would later regret. She just found the clause in the contract she had written herself, and she used it. I keep coming back to table 31, not with bitterness. I've mostly moved past that. But because it taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way. There's a version of the story where I stay quiet, where I take my coat, go home, and file it away like I had filed everything else away for 12 years, where I make the adjustment, recalibrate my expectations one more notch, and tell myself it doesn't matter. I was very good at that version. I had been practicing it for a long time. What stopped me wasn't anger. It was my daughter, asleep down the hall with her stuffed rabbit, not knowing any of this was happening. She was watching me. Not that night specifically, but in the aggregate every day, the way kids watch their parents and build their sense of what's possible for themselves. And I thought, what is she learning from the woman I've become? What does she think it means to have work that matters, to have a name that belongs on something? The things that saved me in that boardroom weren't luck. They weren't connections or money or anything that came from outside. They were things I had built into myself before I ever met my husband. The discipline to file the patent myself when I was 28 and exhausted from my postdoc. The integrity to document every violation, even the ones I let go at the time, because some part of me knew that documentation was not paranoia, it was self-respect. The clause I had drafted into that contract not because I expected to use it, but because I had been raised to understand that clear agreements between people, even people you love, are a form of honesty. Those weren't accidents. They were choices I had made about who I wanted to be, and they were still there, intact, waiting for me, even after 12 years of making myself smaller. That's the thing nobody tells you about going quiet for a long time. You think you're losing yourself, and in some ways you are. I won't pretend those years cost me nothing, but the foundations don't disappear. The work you did before, the knowledge you built, the standards you held yourself to when no one was watching, those stay. They compound quietly, the same way the wrong things compound quietly, except in the opposite direction. My daughter came home from school a week after everything settled and told me she'd told her class I was a scientist and a lawyer. Just like that. Matter of fact. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I had not described myself that way in years. I'd forgotten it was true. She hadn't. She had been paying attention to something in me that I had stopped paying attention to myself. And that, more than the signed resolution or the restructured license or any of it, is what I think about when I think about why it was worth doing. You don't get to decide what your children learn from watching you. You only get to decide who you actually are. The rest is just cause and effect, playing out over time, the way it always does. I am still a biotech attorney. My name is on the documentation now. It was always mine.